All right. So, when you're looking back at these big, global conflicts, it's pretty easy to get kind of lost in the weeds, with the battles and the dates and all the political stuff going on.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting to me, at least, is how these wars like really change the societies that are fighting them.
Right.
They're just transformative.
Yeah.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into one of those like really big changes.
Okay.
We're going to talk about total war and
Okay.
see how World War I is like a really, grim but important example of that.
Okay.
So our mission, like based on all the stuff you sent over, is to try to understand how this conflict like moved warfare from, just the battlefields
Right.
into like every part of the countries that we're fighting. It's like
Yeah.
everyone had to get involved in a way that they just never had to before.
That's exactly right. When we talk about total war, as your sources kind of highlighted, the main idea is that you've got to mobilize like all of a nation's resources.
Okay.
And I mean all of them.
Yeah.
Not just like the military stuff, but the whole economy,
Right.
all their industry.
Yeah.
And most importantly, like all the energy and commitment of all the civilians too.
Oh, wow.
It's about taking like every single part of a country and pointing it towards winning the war.
Okay, so from what I'm seeing in these materials, it goes way beyond, just armies fighting on the front lines.
Yeah.
What makes total war different in this case?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think the big difference is that the line between who's a soldier and who's a civilian gets really blurry.
Okay.
The stuff that people do back home, whether they're working in factories or growing food,
Right.
or even just trying to stay positive when things are really bad,
Right.
it all becomes just as important as what the soldiers are doing out there.
Okay.
The whole country basically turns into this one giant war machine.
Wow. So based on some of these posters and things you sent me, it seems like a big part of getting everyone on board was controlling what people thought.
Uh-huh.
That's where the propaganda comes in, right?
Yeah.
Especially in World War I.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Propaganda became like this super powerful tool in total war.
Okay.
Like your sources say it had all these different goals.
Yeah.
It was about shaping how people saw things,
Okay.
making sure they stayed loyal to their country,
Uh-huh.
and getting them all fired up about being, patriotic.
Right.
But it also got pretty manipulative,
Okay.
like trying to make people feel guilty or scared,
Yeah.
all to get them to help out with the war effort in any way they could.
So when you look at all these posters and pamphlets you sent over, what were some of the main things they were trying to get across during World War I?
Oh man, they were trying to do a lot.
Yeah.
The propaganda back then was all over the place.
Okay.
And some of it was pretty clever.
Okay.
There was a lot of stuff about being patriotic and doing your duty for your country.
Uh-huh.
Like that famous Uncle Sam poster in the U.S.
Right.
I want you.
Yeah.
Or
In Britain, they had similar ones with King George V.
all about getting men to sign up because they felt like they owed it to their country.
Yeah, those are the classic recruitment posters everyone kind of knows.
Right.
But some of the other ones you sent me were a little more targeted, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some of them were aimed at very specific groups.
Okay.
Like, remember that one from America with the really pretty woman?
I do, yeah.
The one that says, I want you for the Navy.
Yeah.
That one was definitely trying to get the attention of young guys,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make them think about adventure and maybe a little romance,
Okay.
but still all tied into serving their country.
Right.
It's interesting, some people who studied those posters said they were trying to reach the average young guy, like the Jose of their time,
Right.
make him feel like the country was talking directly to him.
Interesting. And then there were some that seemed to like really play on people's emotions,
Oh, yeah.
even some darker emotions.
Yeah, for sure. Like, as the war kept going and people started to realize how horrible it really was in the trenches,
Right.
the propaganda had to change.
Okay.
Got a lot more emotional.
Yeah.
Like that famous British poster you sent over that says, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?
I remember that one.
It's pretty powerful.
It is, yeah.
They were trying to make young men feel guilty,
Right.
especially the ones who hadn't signed up yet.
Okay.
Like they were saying, your kids are going to judge you in the future if you don't fight.
Wow.
One of your sources said that this change in propaganda shows how they were starting to understand how much this long war was messing with people's minds.
Right.
And they realized they could use that guilt to get people to do what they wanted.
Yeah. That's a pretty intense tactic.
It is.
Using family and the idea of shame in the future.
Yeah.
What other kinds of messages did they try to use?
Oh, they tried everything.
Okay.
A lot of it was about being a man and fitting in with society.
Okay.
You know, posters with slogans like, be a man and do it.
Join the Navy,
Right.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
They were basically challenging men, questioning if they were strong enough or brave enough.
Right.
Like saying, if you don't enlist, you're not a real man.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they were trying to make the enemy seem as scary and evil as possible.
Okay.
Remember those Beat Back the Hun posters?
Yeah.
They showed this, really gross and monstrous German soldier
Right.
threatening innocent people, or even, Lady Liberty.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'd even use this disturbing image of a, bloody culture bat.
Yeah, I remember that.
It was supposed to represent how barbaric German culture was.
Right.
Really trying to scare people and make them think that fighting the war was the only option.
Yeah, the culture bat imagery is definitely memorable, to say the least.
Yes.
It really shows how much they wanted to make people hate the enemy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds like they started with all this patriotic excitement.
But as the war dragged on and people saw how awful it really was, they had to get more creative with the propaganda.
Huh.
Maybe even a little sneakier to keep people supporting the war.
Yeah, you get it. That's a really important point.
Okay.
A lot of your sources talk about that.
Okay.
At first, people were all gung-ho, super patriotic,
Yeah.
ready to sign up and fight.
Uh-huh.
But then the casualties started piling up.
Right.
The war just kept going and going.
Yeah.
And people started to lose that initial enthusiasm.
Oh, okay.
But the propaganda had to adapt.
Yeah.
It had to become more convincing,
Right.
more emotional,
Uh-huh.
and maybe even a little bit more manipulative,
Okay.
just to keep people from giving up hope and to keep those new recruits coming in.
It makes you think about how different recruiting is today.
Yeah.
Now it seems like they focus more on the benefits you get and career opportunities.
Right.
Not so much on all the emotional stuff and duty to your country
Yeah, that's really interesting.
like they did
Yeah.
back then.
It shows how much society has changed.
Yeah.
What motivates people is totally different now.
Right.
All that stuff about national pride and guilt that they used in World War I,
Yeah.
it probably wouldn't work so well today.
Right. People are looking out for themselves more now.
Exactly.
So besides just getting soldiers to fight total war, also meant changing how countries ran their economies, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Total war requires the government to step in and control the economy
Yeah.
in ways they never would during peacetime.
Okay.
It's like they had to take this whole complicated economic machine
Ah.
and completely retool it to support the war effort.
So looking at the economic data, what were some of the big things that governments did to control the economy during World War I?
Well, they had to do a lot of things,
Okay.
but one of the big ones was trying to keep wages and prices stable.
Right.
They didn't want people freaking out because everything was getting super expensive,
Yeah, that makes sense.
and they had to make sure that everyone could still afford the basics. Especially since a lot of things were getting hard to find because the war was using up so many resources.
Right. And then there was rationing, right?
Oh yeah, rationing was huge.
Yeah.
They started controlling all sorts of basic foods.
Yeah.
Things like meat and cheese and fats.
Right.
They had to do it to make sure the army had enough
Okay.
and to make sure things were divided fairly among the civilians.
Right, because everyone was dealing with shortages.
Exactly.
Rationing must have been a really big deal for people, in their everyday lives.
Oh yeah, it totally changed how people lived.
Yeah.
They had to get used to having less
Right.
and standing in lines for their rations.
Yeah.
And to help make up for those shortages.
Okay.
The government started encouraging people to grow their own food.
Right.
They had all these campaigns about starting gardens at home
Uh-huh.
and even raising chickens and rabbits in their backyards.
Okay.
And then there was all this propaganda about what people should eat.
Right.
They wanted people to eat less of the important stuff like wheat
Okay.
so they could send it to the soldiers.
Yeah.
So they had all these posters encouraging people to eat things like cottage cheese,
Right.
which not everyone loved, but it was nutritious.
Yeah.
And they even tried to make people feel bad about wasting food.
Okay.
They have these posters that showed how many people were dying on the battlefield and from starvation.
Wow.
And they were saying, don't throw away food when people are dying because they don't have any.
That's powerful.
It's a really big deal.
Yeah.
Even kids were encouraged to do their part,
Mm-hmm.
eating their vegetables, even if they didn't like them,
Right.
because it was helping the war effort.
It's amazing how connected everything was.
Isn't it?
From what you ate at home to the soldiers fighting on the front lines.
Yeah,
So how did they pay for all of this?
right. How did they actually fund this huge war?
Yeah.
Well, that was another really important part of total war.
Okay.
They needed a ton of money. So they started selling these things called war bonds.
Okay.
or Liberty bonds, as they were called in the Allied countries.
Okay.
They pushed them really hard,
Yeah.
not just as an investment,
Okay.
but as a patriotic duty.
Okay.
Like, this is your chance to help your country win the war.
Right. By giving them money.
Exactly.
Okay.
The idea was that you'd lend your savings to the government,
Uh-huh.
and they'd pay you back with interest after the war was over.
Okay, but what if they lost the war?
Ah, that's the catch.
Yeah.
Your sources point out that those bonds were only worth anything if your side won.
Oh, wow.
If your country lost,
Yeah.
the economy would probably collapse,
You're right.
and those bonds would be worthless.
So people were taking a big risk.
Yeah, they were.
Wow.
It's like their personal finances were tied to the outcome of the war.
Yeah, and that's a model that governments still use today, right?
They do.
When there are big crises.
It's interesting to think about
It is, yeah.
how that line between being a good citizen and making a financial investment got blurred.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay, so we talked about the money,
Yeah.
but all that money had to go toward actually making stuff for the war.
Right. All the weapons and equipment.
Yeah, so the whole industrial system had to change.
Okay.
Before the war, factories were making all sorts of things for people to buy.
Right. Everyday stuff.
Exactly, like bicycles, radios, all that stuff.
Okay.
But once total war started,
Yeah.
all those factories had to switch to making things for the military.
Right.
Machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks, you name it.
Wow. That's a huge change.
It was.
Yeah.
And it meant that regular people couldn't get a lot of the things they were used to.
Yeah.
They had to make do with less.
Okay.
Another way that total war affected every part of their lives.
Yeah, it really shows how all-encompassing it was.
Absolutely.
And something else that really changed during World War I was the role of women.
Yes.
You know, with all the men going off to fight, women had to step up and take on all sorts of new jobs.
Yeah, this is something that your sources really emphasize. It had a big impact on society and the economy,
Right.
an impact that we're still feeling today.
So we always hear about women working in factories during the war,
Yeah.
but what other kinds of jobs did they do?
They did pretty much everything.
Okay.
They were working in factories,
Uh-huh.
including the really important munitions factories
Right.
where they were making the weapons and ammunition.
Wow.
They were also doing a lot of the farm work
Okay.
to make sure there was enough food for everyone.
Right.
And a lot of women became nurses,
Uh-huh.
taking care of the wounded soldiers,
Okay.
both in hospitals back home and closer to the front lines.
So they were in danger too.
Yeah, they were.
Wow.
And beyond all that, they were doing all sorts of other essential jobs,
Okay.
keeping things running back home.
Right.
So the whole war effort could continue.
So was there specific propaganda aimed at women?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They used propaganda to encourage women to help out in all sorts of ways. There were posters and articles and speeches,
Okay.
all about putting the country's needs first,
Okay.
ahead of their own personal wants.
Okay.
They had slogans like, "Women of Britain say go,"
Right.
which were actually aimed at men.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were using women's voices
Uh-huh.
to try to shame men into enlisting.
Okay.
And in general, they showed women as being really important to winning the war.
Right.
Like their support was essential for the soldiers.
Right. So it sounds like this was a time of huge change for
It
women.
was both good and bad.
Okay.
It was a really hard time.
Right.
But it also gave them opportunities they never had before.
Okay.
Like they could work and earn their own money,
Uh-huh.
which gave them a kind of power they hadn't had before.
But you said that was temporary.
Yeah, unfortunately, in a lot of cases it was.
Okay.
After the war ended and the men came home, there was a lot of pressure on women to go back to how things were before.
Yeah.
You know, back to being housewives and mothers.
That's too bad.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that this was a time of huge social change,
Yeah.
and it paved the way for more progress later on.
Right. So we've talked about propaganda and the economy
Hmm.
and how women's roles changed.
Right.
How did all of this come together to make World War I the ultimate example of total war?
Okay, so World War I is like the textbook example of total war
Okay.
because it was so long and destructive
Right.
that it forced countries to use everything they had.
Okay.
Both sides had all these modern weapons,
Yeah.
which led to this stalemate on the Western Front.
Right.
Remember that crazy network of trenches?
Yeah.
500 miles long,
Wow.
from the English Channel all the way to the Alps.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is.
Yeah.
And they had these huge battles
Yeah.
with insane numbers of casualties.
Right.
Like the Battle of the Somme, where the British lost like 300,000 men.
Wow.
And the Germans lost About 250,000.
And they barely moved the front line.
Exactly.
It's just mind-boggling.
It is.
Yeah.
So because the fighting was so slow and brutal,
Okay.
the countries involved had to rely on everyone back home
Right.
to keep sending supplies,
Yeah.
to keep people from giving up,
Uh-huh.
and to keep sending fresh soldiers to the front.
It's so different from older wars,
Yeah, totally.
where one big battle could decide everything.
Right.
In World War I, it was all about who could outlast the other
Exactly.
and who could keep their home front strong.
And that brings us to how the war actually ended,
Okay.
which really shows how important the home front is in total war.
Okay.
Germany had been struggling for a long time
Yeah.
with food shortages and all sorts of problems. People were only getting like 500 calories a day by the end.
Wow, that's barely enough to survive.
It wasn't.
Yeah.
And it caused all sorts of unrest and chaos.
Yep.
People were just fed up.
Right.
And the government eventually had to give in.
Oh, okay.
They asked for an armistice.
So basically they lost because their own people couldn't take it anymore.
That's basically what happened.
Wow.
It shows that in total war, the strength of your civilians is just as important as the strength of your army.
Right, so total war changed everything.
It did.
It's not just about fighting battles anymore.
Yeah.
It's about getting the whole country involved.
Yeah.
Everyone has to sacrifice.
Yeah, World War I was a huge turning point.
Right.
It showed that war wasn't just about armies anymore.
Yeah.
It was about entire nations fighting each other.
Right. And that changed the relationship between the government, the military, and the people.
Yeah, in a really big way.
And it makes you wonder how those lessons from World War I apply to conflicts today.
Yeah, it really does.
Thinking about how much societies had to change back then,
Uh-huh.
how would we even do that today?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, and what would it mean for our freedom?
Oh.
If the government had that much control.
It's something to think about.
It really is.
How do we balance the need for national security
Right.
with individual rights?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
No, there isn't.
Yeah, it's something we all need to keep in mind
We do.
as we try to understand the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been another fascinating deep dive.
It has.
And as always, it leaves us with more questions than answers.
That's always a good thing.
I think so too.
It means we're thinking
Right.
and learning.
And that's what it's all about.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time
See you later.
for another deep dive
All right.
into history.
It's good.